Hey everybody, welcome to Parker Hill Church Online. I am so glad that you've set aside this time to join us online as we together reconnect our hearts with the heart of God. And let me give a big shout out to those of you who are watching this online service together at a watch party. I'm so glad you've taken the initiative to move out of isolation and into community because we need each other, especially in times like these. And right now we have watch parties meeting in homes all across northeastern Pennsylvania, and we also have watch parties at our 3 Parker Hill buildings. And so if you want to attend a watch party and watch the service with some other folks, just check out our website for more information. Well, this is week number 2 in this teaching series called Afterlife. And during this series, we're just trying to pull back the curtain of time and get a glimpse of eternity. And so we're looking into the pages of the Bible to see what it says about what's waiting for us on the other side. And today I want to do my best to answer a question that lots and lots of people seem to be asking right now. And it's this question: are we living in the last days? In other words, are we close to the end of time and to eternity? Over the last few years, there's been really a growing sense of curiosity about what the future holds and where this world is ultimately headed. I mean, some of the most popular movies these days are movies with an end of the world theme, right? Over the last decade, Hollywood studios have produced more than 100 movies with that apocalyptic theme. Movies like, The Hunger Games, World War Z, Resident Evil, A Quiet Place, Maze Runner, Bird Box. We seem to have this fascination with stories about what the future might hold for us. But for a lot of people, thinking about the future is not only a source of entertainment, it's also a source of fear. In fact, recently I came across an interesting website for a company called Vivos, which is the Latin word for life. And this company has a network of underground bunkers. And for the small sum of $35,000, you can reserve your spot in the bunker and be ready for the end of the world. Listen to what it says on their website. Our spacious living quarters are outfitted and stocked for a minimum of 1 year of autonomous survival to ride out the potential events. Every detail has been considered and planned for. Members need to only arrive before their facility is locked down and secured from the chaos above. And here's how it ends. When the world is falling apart, which side of the door do you want to be on? I mean, there's a growing fear in our culture that the world is falling apart. And the end is near, and the current pandemic and everything else in 2020 has made those fears even greater. I read that Google searches for anxiety and panic attacks are now at an all-time high. Because lots of people are wondering, are we living in the last days? Is history as we know it coming to an end? So for the next few minutes, I want to try to answer that question. But let me tell you right up front what I'm not going to do, okay? Here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to make any predictions. I think one of the things we have to be very careful about is making specific predictions about the future based on what we read in the Bible. I'll give you an example. 9 years ago, there was a nationally known Bible teacher who was predicting that the world would end and Jesus would return on May 21st, 2011. In fact, I first heard about this when I was driving by the Denny's restaurant by my office, and there was this RV parked right out front, and it had this big sign on the back. And at first, I wasn't sure if that sign was meant for everybody or just people who ate at Denny's, like maybe the food will kill you by May 21st. But obviously, that whole prediction, that didn't come to pass. One of the reasons why people avoid talking about Bible prophecy is that reason, because they don't want to be identified with kind of the wackos out there who make these crazy predictions. In fact, let me ask you a question. How many times has the end of the world been predicted? The answer? Thousands, I should say. Here's the second question. How many times have those predictions been accurate? 0. So all that to say, I'm not here to make any predictions. If I was good at predicting the future, I would have stocked up on toilet paper and hand sanitizer in 2019. So no predictions from me, but I can say this. I can say that we have never been closer to the end of time than we are right now. I believe that. And as I study Scripture, I've come to realize that there are some unique things about our moment in history, things that no other generation has ever seen. And I think we need to pay attention to what we're seeing. So I want to spend the next few minutes with you looking at the words of Jesus in Matthew 24. Now, Matthew was one of the 12 disciples, and near the end of his life, he wrote down his eyewitness account of the life of Jesus in this book of the Bible that we call the Gospel of Matthew. And here in chapter 24, Matthew recounts a conversation between Jesus and his disciples. I'll start in verse 3. It says, "As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. 'Tell us,' they said, 'when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?'" The sign of your coming and the end of the age. You see, the Bible speaks clearly about the fact that Jesus not only came into this world, he is also coming into this world. That he will one day set foot on this planet again, and when he does, he will bring justice and peace and healing to this broken world. In fact, there are more than 300 verses of Scripture that talk about the second coming of Christ. Now, we don't know when that will happen. We just know that it will happen. It could be tomorrow. It could be 1,000 years from now. We just don't know. But Jesus gives some signs in this passage, things to look for that will be indicators that the end of time is drawing near. It's kind of like when you go into a store and you see Christmas decorations. Like that's a sign that something big is coming, right? When you see those Christmas decorations in the store, you know that Halloween is just around the corner, right? When you see the signs, you know that something big is coming. And so Jesus gives this list of signs that tell us that history is moving toward the finish line. And there are 6 of them. He says, here's the first sign to watch for: spiritual deception. Verse 4, Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many." So Jesus was saying that as history goes on, there will come a time of great spiritual deception. And in my opinion, there's never been a time in history when it's been so easy to deceive people. We live in the age of the internet, and no other generation has had access to the amount of information that we have access to, like right at our fingertips. But the one problem with a lot of information is that you also have a lot of misinformation. And honestly, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. I mean, technology and social media have made it possible for ideas to gain momentum quickly, whether they are true or not. And because of the reach of technology, a small number of people can have a profound influence on millions or hundreds of millions of people. And so we live in a day of great confusion and deception, and some of that deception is spiritual deception. Now, I won't go into this too deeply because we're going to begin a new teaching series in a couple of weeks where we will address some of the most common deceptions that people believe today. The series is called Undrink the Kool-Aid. It's going to be great, so we'll come back to that in a couple of weeks. But the second sign that Jesus tells us to watch for is this one. He talks about political turmoil. Political turmoil, verse 6. He says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come." He says, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." Now, I don't know if you realize this or not, but when it comes to war, the last 100 years have been the bloodiest years in history. I mean, think about it. In 1917, the U.S. entered World War I, and when it finally ended, the First World War was described as the war to end all wars because the loss of life was so horrific. But then it was only 21 years later, after that war ended, that we found ourselves in the Second World War. And in that war, 85 million people lost their lives. In fact, in 1945, at the end of World War II, the United Nations was founded. And the United Nations was created for one specific reason. This is the opening of the Charter of the UN, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. And yet, in spite of our best efforts, Since 1945, there have been 223 wars. Right now, there are 31 armed conflicts taking place around the world. And we live today in an age of satellite news coverage and embedded reporters. And so we experience war in real time. Came across a picture that's really a powerful reminder of the brokenness and the conflict in our world today. It's a picture of a little boy in Syria, and he's assembling bombs to be used in that civil war. The civil war in Syria has been going on for 9 years. 400,000 people have lost their lives in that conflict. And the phrase here in verse 6 that really gets my attention, though, is where it says, "You will hear rumors of wars." That's fascinating to me because I think we see that happening today in a way that has never been possible before. I mean, think about it. We live in a world of 24/7 news coverage. And news reporting is driven by one thing. It's driven by profit. And if you want to make money, you have to keep people's attention, okay? And here's the thing. Bad news always gets more attention than good news, right? Scandals, shootings, natural disasters, those are the things that dominate news coverage because those are the things that get lots of attention and drive clicks. And then on top of that, there's the tremendous pressure to be the first one to break a story. So consequently, we live in a world where a lot of news coverage is conjecture and hearsay and rumors, and so we're constantly hearing not just about wars, but rumors of war, and we feel constantly like we're in this world that's at so much unrest. Here's the third thing to look for, Jesus said, the third sign that will point to the end. Natural disasters. He goes on to say this, there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Famines and earthquakes. Now, we don't think about famine very much because we live in America where we throw away 12% of the food that we buy. But hunger is still a real issue in the world today. Every 6 seconds, somewhere in the world, a child under the age of 5 dies of hunger. In the last 24 hours, while we've been enjoying our comfortable lives, more than 14,000 preschool children have died simply because their parents couldn't find enough food. And their parents love them every bit as much as we love our kids. And listen to this, 1.2 billion people in the world do not have access to clean water. And because of that, 5 million people die every year from waterborne illnesses. And here we drink water out of plastic bottles because we don't like the taste of the water from our indoor plumbing. And Jesus said, as time moves forward, you'll see more and more and more hunger and famine. And oftentimes that's connected to what we just talked about, to war and conflict. And then also in this verse, Jesus speaks about earthquakes in various places. That's very interesting. There's a website called earthquakereport.com. And so I went on that website. Did you know that this past Friday, there were 20 measurable earthquakes in the world? And 6 of them had a magnitude of 4.5 or greater. Now, I don't know whether we have more earthquakes than we used to have, or if we just have better technology to measure them. I don't know. But either way, we are certainly more aware of them. And Jesus said, look for this. Here's a sign. An increase in natural disasters will be a sign that we're approaching the finish line. And here's the fourth sign to watch for. Jesus talks next about religious persecution. Verse 9. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. And he wasn't speaking just to the disciples who were gathered around him in that moment. He was looking across the century and thinking about followers of Christ collectively. And, when we think of persecution, we think of something that happened, hundreds of years ago in Rome, right? When Christians were being fed to the lions in the Colosseum. But the truth is, religious persecution is far more common today than it was in the first century. There's a nonprofit organization called Open Doors that tracks religious persecution. And according to their website, in 2020, 260 million Christians are suffering high to severe levels of persecution. And I tracked that back, and that number increases by about 10% every year. Last year, there was an article on the BBC News website, and the headline of the article caught my attention. It said this, Christian persecution at near genocide levels. Now, thankfully, we as Americans are protected from outright persecution. We live in a nation where our religious freedom is protected, but let's be honest, even here, there's been a cultural shift. I mean, you can feel it. You can hear it. It has become more acceptable now to criticize people of faith. I'll give you one example from the book entitled God Is Not Great, subtitled How Religion Poisons Everything, written by Christopher Hitchens about 10 years ago. And this is what he writes in the intro to that book. He says, as I write these words and as you read them, people of faith are, in their different ways, planning your and my destruction. Religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to human survival. Now, his opinion is not an outlier. That book sold millions of copies. In fact, 3 weeks after it hit the market, it reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. See, sincere believers today are no longer seen as a blessing to this world. They are increasingly perceived as a problem. And Jesus said, watch for that. Persecution will be a sign of the last days. Fifth sign to look for, number 5, and I know this has been so encouraging so far, and I'm sure this one will just add to that. Verse 12, moral decay. Verse 12, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. And I don't even need to quote statistics on this one, right? I think we can all just agree that the world is becoming more and more wicked and more cold-hearted. People are more angry, less compassionate, more divided. We are rapidly losing our sense of common decency and respect for each other. Now, one more sign that Jesus mentioned, and I like this last one. This last one is exciting. It's encouraging. Sign number 6 that Jesus tells us to look for is this one: global communication. Global communication. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, here's what's so amazing about this. At that point, Jesus and his followers had never even traveled 50 miles from their hometown. And yet he says to them, this message of my kingdom will eventually be heard and understood by people of every nation. I mean, that would have seemed so impossible for this little band of fishermen and tax collectors to think that they would start a worldwide movement, but it happened. And I'll tell you what, we live in such an amazing time to be alive, because we live in a world where the gospel message is being declared in ways that have never before been possible, that are unimaginable. In fact, this online service that you're watching right now, almost anyone in the world has the opportunity to watch it with you. In fact, a few weeks ago, we had people watching the online service from Parker Hill in the Cayman Islands and in Kenya. I mean, opposite sides of the world. It's an amazing time to be alive. I saw this in an article in the Denver Post about Bible translation. It said, by 2025, translators expect to have the Gospel of John written in every single one of the world's 6,909 spoken languages, and then from there to be able to translate the rest of the Bible. Fascinating. So here's what Jesus said. He said, here's what you should expect. Look for spiritual deception, political turmoil, natural disasters, religious persecution, moral decay, and global communication of the gospel. Now, you may be wondering, well, that's all very interesting, but what does that mean for my life? So here's the question. Here's the question with all this. How should we respond? What should we do in light of what we see every day around us and in the news? Well, let me go back into the passage and just pull out a couple of key phrases that tell us how we should respond to what we see happening around us. Go back to verse 6. Jesus said this, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen. In other words, when you see these things happening, when you see these events begin to unfold, don't be surprised. Don't freak out. Don't be overwhelmed. These things need to unfold. They need to happen. And then Jesus goes on to say this. Here's why. Verse 8. All these are the beginning of birth pains. The beginning of birth pains. I mean, this is a powerful word picture, and I think it gives us a very helpful framework for understanding what we're seeing in the world right now. These are the beginning of birth pains. Later on, in the writings of the Apostle Paul to the Christians in Rome, you see the same idea. Romans chapter 8, he says, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." Fascinating metaphor here. Now, giving birth is a very painful experience. I know this because as a good husband, I was there in the delivery room. I saw the whole thing, so I know that giving birth is very difficult. But here's the thing. The pain of labor is a pain that precedes great joy. It's a pain that signals the beginning of new life. And after a mom gives birth, it's the pain of labor that's quickly overshadowed by the joy of holding that new baby. And here's what Jesus was saying. He was saying, when you see these signs, when you see the groaning and the pain and the calamity in this world, just remember that the groanings of this world are the labor pains of God's kingdom. All the groanings of this world are the labor pains of God's kingdom. And someday there's going to be a new birth, a new beginning. There's a time coming when God is going to restore everything. Imagine that time with me. Imagine a time and a place where we won't need words anymore like pain and sadness and fear and prejudice and hatred. Imagine a place where you'll never have to stand by the hospital bed of a loved one and watch them suffer. Imagine a time where you will never watch your son or daughter drive out of the driveway and wonder if they're ever coming back. Imagine a time and a place where you'll never again sit in front of a counselor trying to sort out your broken marriage relationship. Jesus says a new birth is coming, a new beginning is coming, and these are just the labor pains. If you go all the way to the end of the Bible, almost the very last chapter, in Revelation chapter 21, it describes what's on the other side of these labor pains. It says, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. And there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.'" So in closing, let me speak to three different groups of people. First of all, let me speak to those of you who are not yet believers. You wouldn't describe yourself as a Christian. Maybe you're just searching for answers. You found us online. Here's what I would say to you. You need a hope that is bigger than this world. You need something more than the empty promises of a world that's so unstable and so unpredictable. And I like what Jesus said in John chapter 16, verse 33. He said, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I," he says, "have overcome the world." And listen, the only way to have peace in such an unpredictable world is to know the God who holds the world in his hands. And by the way, remember this. Whether or not we are living in the last days, you are living in your last days. The Bible says that your life is like a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Life is so brief and it's so unpredictable. And if you're not yet a believer, if you're not a follower of Christ, I hope the uncertainty of these days will drive you to look beyond this world and seek out the only real source of hope there is, and to accept Jesus, the one who conquered death, who conquered the tomb, to accept him as the forgiver of your sin and the leader of your life. Okay, secondly, let me speak to those of us who are followers of Christ, who are Christians. What should we do in light of current events? Should we build a bunker, stock up on food and water and just kind of huddle in safety? Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's a good idea to be reasonably prepared for the future, whatever the future might hold. But listen, as a follower of Christ, my ultimate trust is not in a bunker or in my food supply. My ultimate trust is in the God who controls history and holds me in his hand. And for those of us who know Christ, there is no need for us to be filled with fear. Instead, we should be filled with a sense of hopeful expectation, just like a mother in labor with a child. Let the bad news that we hear every day just be a reminder that this world is not our ultimate home. There is something better. Finally, let me speak to us collectively as a church. I think the last thing we ought to do as believers is to develop a bunker mentality where we just kind of hang on and hunker down and meet together and close out the world while the world falls apart. Just hang out and wait for Jesus to come. No, we should not have a bunker mentality. I think we as a church need to have what I would describe as a lifeboat mentality. This world is a slowly sinking ship, and we've been given a lifeboat, the message of the gospel. And our job as a church is to get as many people as possible into the lifeboat before the ship goes down. We are called to love the people of this world, to give them a glimpse of God's kingdom, and to point our friends and our neighbors to the only real hope there is. We don't exist as a church just to hide from the problems of this world. We as a church are committed to our mission of being light in a world that is increasingly dark, because history is winding down and eternity is nearer than it's ever been. Now, next week, we're going to continue this series, and we'll talk about what eternity holds for us if we are in Christ. And if you're wondering what heaven will be like, and if you're wondering whether we're all just going to spend eternity sitting on clouds and playing harps, you need to make sure to tune in next weekend, because there is something far better and more beautiful in store for us than what you may have in mind. Now, if you're watching this service with a few other people or a group of people, take a few minutes to talk about how this applies to your lives. Because like I say, the real impact from this teaching is not what I've said, it's what you put into practice. So we'll have a few questions on the screen at the end of the broadcast. Take advantage of those.